So, in an era of social Darwinism, when people believe very strongly that the wealthy are wealthy because of some sort of genetic superiority to other people, and we have the development of what we would later consider labor issues, the big question is, if evolution favors the survival of the fittest, why should the strong help the weak to survive? The working conditions during the Industrial Revolution for the average worker were pretty terrible. They worked long hours, usually in excess of 12 hours a day, and had very little pay. They were traditionally working unskilled labor jobs. Unskilled meaning they didn't need an education or significant training in order to do that job. It could be, like in this picture, shovel this and put it there. Typically, jobs that people work in high school are unskilled labor jobs where you might get some training, but your training is maybe a day or two. You don't have to get a college degree to do that job that you're doing. Working conditions were very similar to a sweatshop. In fact, they were in some cases very sweaty, especially if you worked in a steel mill, which could be very hot. Um, Sweatshop conditions and the working conditions were extremely unhealthy and very dangerous. Industrial accidents happened all the time because there weren't effective protective codes and things like that. There weren't any regulations that said, you need to have warnings when things are hot. You have to have, certain gloves when you're doing work. That type of thing. There were very few requirements or regulations in business because of the laissez-faire economy. So things were very dangerous. It was common for people to lose limbs or fingers, go blind, that type of thing. Extremely dangerous working conditions. There were few jobs due to increases in technology. We did have a boom and some openings for jobs, but because A, there were so many people immigrating to the country, and B, technology was improving, there's actually a lot of competition for jobs. So workers didn't really have security. If you wanted your working conditions to improve, there really wasn't the ability to ask for those improvements because there was always somebody living on the streets that would be willing to do your job if you didn't want it. So there was no security and no benefits. Certainly nothing like the benefits we have today for healthcare and personal days and sick days and things like that. And I think sometimes we can take sick days for granted, but employees could not take sick days. The living conditions for the poor and for the workers were pretty terrible. Most companies would create things like company towns where workers lived in places that were owned and run by their company. So the company would put up housing around the city. Actually, the city of Manchester was a company town. It was established to house the workers for the textile mills in Manchester. These company towns were kind of shady in that you would get paid and then you would go home and you would have to pay your rent back to your employer. Oftentimes, these places would have inflated prices because they essentially had a monopoly on where you lived, where you ate you got your groceries, where you shopped, everything like that. So essentially, they could make it so that every penny that you earn goes back to them, so they don't really actually pay you anything. Very similar to slavery in some ways. Um, they would get paid in scrip, and scrip is company money used for exchange. So basically, they didn't pay you in US dollars. You would get paid, but you would get paid in, say, Carnegie dollars. And so you could only, if you wanted to buy food at the company store, you would pay them there. But you didn't have choice. These workers didn't have choice as to where they got their groceries, where they lived, and that type of thing. And company script could only be used at those companies' stores. So you get paid in scrip, and then you can't go to a neighboring town and buy dinner out with your grandparents or something like that because you don't have actual money. You only have scrip, which is basically paper fake money that is useful in exchange. It'd basically be like having a gift certificate. People that didn't live out in the country where a lot of the big mills and other things were lived in the city. And if you lived in the city, you lived in something, most likely you lived in something called a tenement, which was basically cheap housing. And tenements were put up largely to deal with the huge immigrant population, but the picture to your right is a picture of Brooklyn, New York, and one of the tenements there. And there was a lot of crime and little enforcement, poor sanitation, and very limited space for people to live. Often, a family of 6 or 7 would live in a one-bedroom apartment that had, poor running water. Maybe it had a bathroom, that type of thing. It was pretty gnarly living. So I've used Manchester as an example. The Manchester mills are the Amoskeag mills, and these are a picture of the Amoskeag mills in the Industrial Revolution. Some other industrial towns in New Hampshire are places like Laconia, Franklin, Claremont, Lebanon, etc. Amoskeag, though, was the largest, and so it was actually a model for future factory city building because the homes were a little bit nicer than other factory towns. They created row houses. They put up parks and churches for their employees to use and participate in activities in. So outside of company towns and in more like major cities, we see the rise of political machines. Combating industrialization, combating industrial tycoons was really difficult for the government to do. And so there starts to be this sort of development of political bosses. And these are political leaders who got people to vote for them by giving them favors. Usually, they were maybe from the middle class or maybe even lower class, who sort of realize that they have an opportunity to make money by getting into politics, and so they, seeing the plight of the poor and other things, they say, "You vote for me, and I'll make sure this happens for you." And it's usually done in kind of shady backroom deals. The ring of people that made the deals and got the votes for the political boss were called the political machine. And usually, what they would do is bully people into voting for them, and sort of muscling people around. In New York City, the political machine was called Tammany Hall, and this building still exists today. And the big boss was Boss Tweed, who stole, actually in his lifetime, stole millions of New York City funds. So Boss Tweed was super influential in politics, especially during Lincoln's campaign and other things. He, would throw his money and his weight around, and sort of manipulate things to get things done, but also sort of to look out for himself. The social gospel, this is a term to describe a movement, and a belief system that developed in reaction to social Darwinism. Um, it arose to combat this bleak landscape of working conditions and lifestyle during the Industrial Revolution. Social gospel is what is essentially a Christian belief that through reform efforts, legislation for child labor, slums, tenement houses, and unsafe working conditions, human beings could really build the kingdom of God on earth. This social gospel is sort of an early progressive movement. Progressives are people that believe that legislation and government intervention is the way to solve social problems. One of the leaders of this movement, Brian, last name Brian, created a comparison where he said, essentially, we weed our gardens. He compared society to a garden, and he said, we take away those weeds. Why should we? Essentially, the question is, why should we weed? Why should we? Keep these stronger plants, the weeds, from taking over the roses. And he's saying we weed to give the rose a chance, to give that beauty a chance to grow. We also saw a rise in fundamentalism. Americans began to see in the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, Americans began to challenge the Bible text and began to see it instead as history, as historical, and in need of interpretation. And they saw in the text sort of a change in the way people related to God over time. And so there was a need from a sort of conservative Christian perspective for fundamentalism. And so fundamentalism is essentially a back to basics ideology created to combat things like evolution, but they wanted to take the Bible literally and take its literal meaning and and to look at sort of fundamentally what Christianity is, what the Bible is telling Christians to do. And in effect, fundamentalism, while it's combating sort of the teaching of evolution, which in their opinion goes against the Bible, fundamentalists actually helped to get rid of this sort of social Darwin theory being applied, and they in another way helped to challenge that. Another thing that begins to happen is something called unionization. So essentially, think of unionization as strength in numbers. In this picture, you can see that capitalism is creating poverty, prostitution, wage slavery, child labor, and even war. And so, unions are essentially a way for average workers to have a way to bargain with their employers about their working conditions. So they're living in these terrible conditions, and if they say something about the conditions, if they complain about their work environment, they might get fired because there's somebody who's willing to take their job and replace them. So people created unions. They realized that they had strength in numbers, and they began something called collective bargaining, where the collective group of workers negotiated between, had negotiations between their leaders, the collective leaders of the union, and the company. And this was a slow way of developing better conditions and better laws. And so people would the workers would unionize, and then they would elect union leaders, and so they would have a couple people that are supposed to represent them, and those union leaders would represent the union, the workers, to the employer, and they would say things like, we would really like to not work 12 hours a day. We think that that's excessive. We understand that we need to produce things, but this is too much. We have families, we have children, we need to take care of them, that type of thing. And the companies would push back, and they would say, well, we really can't, we really can't do less than 10 hours a day. And they'd say, okay, great. And so they'd work out some sort of negotiation there. Needless to say, companies really didn't like unionization because it decreased production, and it basically challenged their authority to run the business, and they felt like it was giving workers too much of a say in how business was run. So there's a couple terms that you need to know for how companies would deal with unionization. One thing was unions would often get together and they would protest. If collective bargaining failed, unions would protest. They would walk out of work, they would have a strike, that type of thing. And so when that happened, companies would either have to shut down their operations or they would just hire new employees. And so there's a derogatory term, scabs, which is a word used to describe workers that are hired to replace workers who protest. So if you go on strike and a company hires somebody else, that person is a scab, meaning they're kind of betraying the industry, betraying other workers like you. If you were a scab and you went to work, the people that used to work there and are out on protest would bully you. They would throw things at you, as seen in this picture, because you're essentially undercutting all the protest work that they're trying to do to improve the situations, and you're essentially cutting their legs out from underneath them. Another term is blacklists. Companies would try to discourage people from doing protests, from other things like that, by keeping a blacklist. And this is basically just a list of troublemakers. And why would they do that? Why would they keep this list? Well, if you ever quit your job or if you ever left your job, blacklists were a way for them to keep you from ever getting hired in that industry ever again. So you leave Carnegie Steel because the working conditions there are terrible, and you try to go to another steel company, you're not going to get hired. Yellow dog contracts. Yellow dog contracts are basically contracts. Yellow dog usually means coward. And so yellow dog contracts are contracts for cowards, where workers were forced to agree to not join a union before they were allowed to work at a company. So Carnegie Steel would use these a lot. They would say, you can work for us, but you have to agree that you will not unionize, and you'll just work until we don't want you anymore. Some examples of labor unions are the National Labor Union. And what had been happening during the industrial era was that different labor unions would pop up. So you'd have like a steel labor union, then you'd have an oil labor union, a railroad labor union. And the National Labor Union's goal was to sort of bring everybody together. This union was formed in 1866 and attracted 600,000 members, including skilled and unskilled farmers. It pushed for social reform, an 8-hour workday, and arbitration of labor disputes. So they advocated for the government to get involved, which is kind of a progressive ideology. Progressives, again, want government intervention and regulation. The National Labor Union did not do much for blacks or women, and actually really struggled to fight pushback that they got from corporations. And so that was problematic for them, and they actually dissolved in 1874. But out of the remnants of the National Labor Union comes two different unions. One is the Knights of Labor. This is the largest and one of the most important American labor organizations of the 1880s. They began actually doing things kind of secretively, and their slogan was, "An injury to one is a concern of all." By 1886, the group had 700,000 members. This included women and black people. The group was led by a man pictured here, Terence Powderly, who committed the organization to fighting for the 8-hour workday, the abolition of child labor, equal pay for equal work, and graduated income tax. And graduated income tax is basically saying that the more you make, the more you should be taxed. So that for example, a flat tax is everybody's taxed the same amount. And a graduated income tax is saying that wealthy people should be taxed more, so that essentially they're forced to be philanthropic. They're forced to give money to the poor, to the community. Terence Powderly did away with all that secrecy, and he basically started pushing outright for these different things, which I think made the union popular. Another that came out of the sort of collapse of the National Labor Union is the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. This one was led by a man named Samuel Gompers. And this was a craft union that did not work for industry workers. So if you worked in the steel industry, this was not your type of union. This was a union for skilled people, people that have skills, some sort of talent, and use those in their work. Samuel Gompers was a former cigar maker and came up through sort of the cigar industry and became a union leader there. He used collective bargaining in his work. He was against socialism, which is essentially the belief that the government should be involved. He was very pragmatic and sort of solved problems in a black and white certain sort of way. And he wanted employers to agree to only hire union workers. That was one of the big things that he pushed for. A lot of people said the Knights of Labor and the AFL should join together, and he said in response to that, talk of harmony with the Knights of Labor is bosh. They are as great enemies of trade unions as any employer. He did not think that unskilled workers needed to be involved, and I think this sort of mentality it was kind of problematic, and eventually the AFL does join with industrial workers, and the AFL actually still exists today with a different name, but it joined with industrial labor unions. In the early 1900s, in 1905, we see the rise of the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. And their thing was, we don't want to have steel workers and we don't want to have railroad workers unions. We want to have one big union, and not just an American union, but like anybody in the world who works in an industrialized society, we should all be united together. This was a radical idea, and the IWW was a radical labor union. They pushed for protests, whether they be violent and otherwise, destruction of property if necessary. Socialists and even anarchists who are against government would join this group, and basically just fighting back against the man. The IWW challenged the capitalist system. They said that the system itself is wrong. They would go on strikes, do boycotts, and even sabotage. There are a couple videos on my website about the IWW because this was a very radical organization. One early success that unionization and political bosses have is the Sherman Antitrust Law. It was the first major attempt by Congress to deal with labor issues. And you can see here that Congress does vote on this issue and pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, but you can see all the robber barons in the back trying to make sure that they do it in a way that doesn't actually do anything. So while Congress tried, this act was relatively ineffective. So, as an exit question, I want you to think about whether or not unions are still necessary today. So, are unions still necessary today? This is a really important question because unions are essentially to thank for having sort of reasonable work hours, safety precautions in work, in business, and so we have unions to thank for the current working situation that we have in our country. That said, there's a lot of people that argue that unions make things more complicated. They decrease production in business. They protect bad employees, etc. So have a conversation with your parents and see what they think and consider, do you think unions are still necessary today? And bring your writing in on an exit question on some sort of piece of paper.